If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies and area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome back to our top-down dungeon tutorial. In the last episode, we added state machines to help manage our objects and their sprites more easily. In this follow-up episode, we will allow damage to be shown on an entity and set up a cool death animation for our unlucky enemies. Also stay around till the end, as I have some news on something many people have been requesting. So let's go look at our player step event from the last tutorial. Now that we have all the states working, we can ensure when we kill an enemy, they move to the dead state, and while in that state, our arrows no longer damage them. So to do that, we'll need to add some hit points or some HP onto the enemy. So let's go to our enemy parent, and let's go to the create event, and let's add some HP. I'm going to do it up the top. I'm just going to say HP_max is equal to 15. And our HP is equal to HP max. So in order to show a health bar later on, we need to know the maximum health that they can have, and HP is the current health that they have. So now where the enemy loses health is where an arrow hits them. So let's go into our O arrow, and let's look at our collision event with the enemy. So at the moment, we're just destroying the arrow in here and destroying the enemy. But instead, the arrow only does 5 damage. Our enemy has 15 health, so they're going to take a hit. They're not going to die straight away. Now, in order to deal damage, I'm going to create a function, as dealing damage is something you want to do at other times, so being able to call it when needed will save you time later on. So let's create a function, and we'll call it damage entity. So instead of just destroying the enemy, I'm going to ask if the other.hp, so if the enemy's HP is greater than 0, then we want to damage them. So include that arrow die in there, and we'll run our damage entity function. So we'll just close that up. Let's go and create this damage entity function. If we look at our scripts where we're placing all of our functions, damaging the entities can work for enemies or players. It works for either of them. We want both of them to be able to be damaged. So let's make a new script and call it entity processes. And now in here, we can have our damage entity. So what is this going to do? Well, it's going to damage the target, and it's going to return the dead status. Now I'm going to pass some variables to this function. Firstly, we want to know the target ID. So the ID of the entity we want to damage. Now we also want to pass the source ID, and that is the entity that delivered the damage. Then we're going to have a damage variable indicating how much they're being damaged, and a time indicating how long they're going to be knocked back from the damage. So right here, we just want to have an argument for our target ID, and we can write that this is a real, and it is the actual target ID. Let's duplicate this a few times, and let's have a source ID. And this is our source ID, so where the damage is coming from. Then we also have our damage, and this is a real again, and this is how much damage to deal. And lastly, we had our time, and that's a real again, but this time it's how long to knock back the target. So that's all our arguments. Now what we want to do is deal that damage to the target. So we can just do a with target ID, And now everything we run in between these brackets runs as if we're running it from the target itself. So let's minus the damage from the HP. So we're taking the damage off the existing HP of this target, whether this is a player or an enemy. Now, once we've taken the damage off, it's possible that this entity is actually dead. It's possible they've got 0 or less HP. So I'm going to store that status in a variable called dead, and I'm going to check and say, are they dead? Is dead. Basically, that's another function that we're going to run. So let's just add that here. Function is dead. And all this does is check if the instance running this is dead. And we can check that by looking at their HP. But I don't want to run this if they're already dead. So if our state is not equal states.dead, well, then we can check and say if our HP is less than or equal to 0, then they're dead. So their state is going to equal states.dead. Their HP is going to equal 0. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because we took off the damage here. And if we did that, we might have a negative value for HP. So here we're just making sure that HP can't be a negative value. Now I'm going to also set the image index to be 0. And I'm doing that so that we can play our death animation from the first frame. And now I'm going to set this up for later, but you would then add a switch statement here and you would look at the object index, which is whether you are O player or O enemy or O anything else, it'll look at that and you can set a sound. So let's set the death sound. So I don't have any sounds yet, but I'm just doing this to show you why you'd want to set something up like this. And we'll set our default to be some sort of sound that we play for when the enemy dies. So we want to play the sound in here. And then we'd also have a case for our O player. And then we'd play the player's sound when they die. Now, as I said, I don't have these, but I just wanted to show you that there is a reason why we're doing all of this, and it's something that we're setting up for later. Now, I did say that we're checking if we're dead, and we want to return true or false if we're actually dead. So if we're in here, then we want to make sure that we return true. Because our HP was less than 0, we are dead. Now, up here, if the state is not equal dead, we only run this once, and that's why I've got that check in there. But if state is dead, well, then we're still dead. So we still can return true here. Now, if I don't say return false, false is returned by default. So when you run this function, it'll run through this code, and return means go back to where you ran this and set this variable to whatever this returns. So in this case, dead is going to be set to true, or this will return 0 and dead will be set to false. I just wanted to take a break and appreciate who makes these videos possible. I spend many days creating this content and editing into a tight package for you to digest, and it would not be possible without my Patreon supporters. So this month, I want to thank these legendary Patreon members, Kaiser Andy K, Big Honk, Christian, and Sergio Mora. If you want to show your appreciation, you can do so over on the Patreon site. Now let's continue. So back up here, what else do we do after we've damaged an entity? Well, for the enemy, I want to set their path to be ended. And that means that they'll stop moving towards us and they'll have a little break after they get hit. Now I also want to knock them back. So we want to set a knockback distance. And when the enemy dies, I want them to be knocked back further than they are if they're just hit while they're running at us. And that's where we can use this dead variable. So if dead, then our distance is going to be 4. Else var dis is just going to be equal to 1. So we won't knock them back as much. Now I'm going to take that distance and move them back based on where our source damage come from. So imagine the player shooting the enemy, where they're standing and where the enemy is. We want to look at this direction and move them back away from the player. And that's why we're capturing the source and we know the target. So that'll then give us that direction to push them back. So let's find that direction. And we're going to say var dir is equal to point direction of our source position. So underscore sid.x underscore sid.y. Now that's where the damage came from, and where we're delivering it to is the target's x and y. But the target is where we're running this code from, right here. So we don't need to write TID for this. We can just write x and y. So now that we have direction, we can apply this to a HSP variable and a VSP variable, and we can push the enemy in that direction. So their HSP is going to be a plus equals, because I'm going to add it onto the existing HSP, and we're going to use a function called length dir x, and this takes a length and a direction. So our length is this distance variable, and our direction is our underscore dir. So what this does is calculate using a bit of trigonometry, basically a triangle, and it gives you the x position or the x portion of the movement. And if we duplicate this, we can change this to a VSP and change this to underscore y. So now we have the HSP and VSP being applied. It'll move them the distance and direction that we've asked. Now we also want to use this time, how long they get knocked back for. So the enemy has a calc path delay variable, and that's how long till they make a calculation for a new path. And I'm going to set it to that time. That way they won't calculate a new path while they're being knocked back. Now I'm going to set their alert to be true, so they know that the player exists. And we want to set a knockback time to be that time variable as well. And that's how long they'll show that hurt animation for. Now the last thing to do is just return if they're dead or not. And that might be just something that's useful. We might use that later on. But for now, I'm just going to return it. We're not going to use it in this particular tutorial. And if you're using drag and drop or visual, you will need to add the arguments in. You can just click the little plus, and then you can add extra arguments just there. So the only thing you might notice is that these variables come up as only being referenced once, and that's because we're not using HSP and VSP at all. Now HSP stands for horizontal speed and VSP is for vertical speed. So this is how far they're going to be moved along the X. This is how far they're going to be moved up and down the Y. So we need to go and create these variables in OEntity. So let's just go to the entity parent, go to the create event, and then we'll set our HSP to be 0 and our VSP to be 0. So the only other thing to do is just go into our arrow again, and just if you recall, we actually had our damage entity, but we're not passing any variables to it. So what is our target ID? Well, the target is our other. That's the other in the collision. Our source ID, well, that's where if we go into our create event, we had an owner ID of the arrow. And when the player creates the arrow, the owner ID is set to the player. So in here, the source ID is just the owner ID. What is the damage? We can just set that to damage because that comes directly from here. And the last one is our time. And we also have a knockback time. So we'll set that as well. Great, let's press play and test that out. And now when I hit the enemies, well, they're not being knocked back and they are going into their dead state and they're playing their dead animation, but essentially they look like jumping beans on the ground. So there's a few things that are happening that shouldn't be happening. Firstly, when we're hitting the enemies, they're not being knocked back. And that's because we're not applying our HSP and our VSP to the position of the enemy. We have to apply that per step to make the move. And secondly, we need to stop that animation when it's played out once. And we can do that by going down to our enemy parent. And then in here, let's add a new event. And I'm going to add an other animation end event. Now this will run after the animation has finished playing. And because it'll run every time an enemy's animation finishes, we're going to use a switch statement and we're going to check the state of the enemy. And here we can look for the states.dead. And if we're in the dead state, well, therefore we just want to play that animation once. So I'm going to set the image index to be the image number -1. and that'll set it to the last frame of the animation. And then I'm going to set the image speed to be 0 so it stops playing the animation. So that'll stop them from jumping up and down. Now you might also notice that the depth ordering was wrong, and sometimes enemies would appear behind or in front of others when they shouldn't. And this is because the draw event takes place in the order of the instance's creation. But there is a variable called depth that we can use to tell GameMaker which instance to draw next. So I'm going to set the depth last in the step event by adding it to the enemy add-in script. And an easy way to ensure objects are drawn in order in a top-down game is to just set the depth to the negative of the B-box bottom, as that means the vertical position in the room will determine what gets drawn first. So if we go and have a look at our enemy, and we'll just go into the step event of the enemy, and just in our enemy and in function, just down the bottom here, I'm going to set the depth, and I'm just going to set depth to equal negative B-box bottom. Now, the other thing we needed to do was to apply that HSP and VSP to our enemy to knock them back when they get hit. So let's go have a look at the step event for the enemy. And just as the first function, I'm going to call a function here called calc entity movement. And we're going to use this to calculate entities movements. So I'm going to take a copy of that line and paste it here as well. And I'm going to do the same for the attack state and for the dead state. So we need to create this. So let's just go into our enemy processes. All I'm going to do is just up the top here, I'm going to make a new function called calc entity movement. Let's bring that over. And basically the description of this is it'll move the enemy and apply the drag. Drag meaning that it'll slow down the enemy over time. So the first thing to do is to apply that movement. And we're going to take our HSP and apply it to our X. So X plus equals HSP, and do the same for the Y. This time we'll add the VSP. Remember, that's the vertical and the horizontal speed. Now we also need to apply some slowdown so that the HSP and the VSP move to 0 over time. And that'll simulate them slowing down from natural drag. So I'm going to slow them down by actually just multiplying them by global.drag. So times equals is used just like plus equals. It'll times HSP by that value. So I'm going to press Ctrl D and we'll just duplicate that line and change that to VSP. So we don't have a global.drag variable yet, so we'll create that in a moment. But if we set global.drag to be a value just lower than 1, it'll move HSP and VSP to 0 over time. So I'm also going to run another function here called check if stopped. And what that'll do, if I write it here, check if stopped, it'll check if HSP and VSP are close to 0. And if they are, it'll set them to 0. And this is handy because when you are relying on states to move to different animations, you want to make it happen quickly. And what normally happens with your HSP or VSP when you're trying to move them to 0 is they'll take a long time to get to 0 when they're very close to it because the numbers become very small. So to save that, I like to just say if our ABS, so the absolute value of our HSP, is less than 0.1, well then that's close enough and I'm going to set HSP to 0. Now let's duplicate that and do the same thing for our VSP. So this will then move those values to 0 when they're close to it. Now we're getting an error here, and that's because these values are only referenced once, and that's here only. So let's take a copy of that. Let's go over to our OGame in our control. And just in the create event here, let's add our global.drag. And I'm just going to set it to 0.93. So how this drag value works is the higher it is, the closer to 1 that it is, the less drag that's applied. So it'll take longer to slow down. Now, if we just go back to our enemy, we'll just go into our enemy parent and just into our enemy. And I just want to have a look at the step event. Now, in our calc entity movement, we're going to be applying HSP and VSP every step, and we're going to be moving the instances around. Now, what that might do is create some collisions, because if we're pushing our instances into solids, we don't want them to go through the solid. And we have a solution for that. We actually have a collision script that we've been running on the player. So back in our entity parent and in our player, we actually have a collision script that we run in the player, and it checks for a collision with OSolid, and then it runs that collision script, and that's how our collisions work. So we want to apply this to the enemy as well. So let's take a cut of this, go into our entity parent, and let's paste it here. So now anytime we have an entity, they'll also have collisions with solids. I just want to pause there quickly and give a huge thank you to my epic Patreon supporters this month. They are Sky Devil Palm, Edward Lyko, Paul Ala Blank, Robert Churches, Sudo, Sapita, Defong Singh, Firas Harden, Chris LeBlanc, Sadface, Anthony Sanderson, James Gaget, Peter Gressing, Dennis Evans, Slime Dungeon Official, and Nick. Thank you very much for your support. It's greatly appreciated. Now, the other thing that happened was just in our O arrow, where we just set up the collision with the parent and we set up our entity script, we have this knockback time variable. Now, I want to use that so that we can show a hurt animation for the enemies when they get hit. So let's go back over here to our enemy processes. And I'm just going to go down the bottom here and let's add a function, show hurt. And basically this will just show the hurt sprite when being knocked back. So we can do that just by looking at that knockback time. And if it is greater than 0, then we can set our sprite index to be s_hurt. And this is a hurt sprite that we set up in the create event. Now I've taken a ---- here. So when we set knockback time to 10 or whatever, when we get hit, this will actually take the value down. But while it's above 0, we'll be showing that hurt sprite. So once again, we're showing that this has only been used once. We need to now use this up here where we're showing our animation. So we're setting the idle sprite, but let's do a check here of the hurt as well, because we might want to change to that if we're being hurt. Now I'm not going to do it in the attack or the dead because I only want to change it in these two states. If the enemy's attacking, I want them to keep their sprite, and that is the attack sprite. Obviously, if they're dead, we want them to stay dead and not show that they're hurt as well. So because we're referring to a knockback time variable, we need to create this variable for the enemy. So I'm just going to go and create it for the entities because we might want to use this for the player as well. So just in here, we can have our knockback time. Basically, this is for how long we are knocked back for. And it'll just be called knockback time. And I'm going to set it to 0 at the moment. Now, just on our arrow again, just go back in there. I'm going to change it to 1 just for 1 frame, but you can modify it however you like. So let's press play and have a look. So now when we hit them, they get knocked back a little bit, and when they've got no more health, they get knocked back quite a lot, and they bounce on the ground. It looks great. You can see that the depth is working there as we walk back and forth over this enemy, and you can see the enemies at the front, they're actually drawn over top of the enemies behind them. So that's working great. Now, there's a little problem with the facing direction there. I'm just going to go into our functions for enemy processes and just here where we're doing our check facing. Now, we want to make sure that if you're being knocked back, I don't want them to change their facing direction. So you can just say if knockback time is less than or equal to 0, then we can check the facing. Otherwise, if they're being knocked back, I don't want them to change their facing direction. Now, the other thing I said we'd add would be a health bar so you can see which enemies have been damaged. And we can draw that above their head. Now we can create that in the draw event, and because we want to use it for enemies and players, we can create a function in the oEntityParent draw event. So because the health bar will be drawn for the player and the enemy, I'm going to put it into our entity processes. I'm also going to put this check if stopped because we were going to use that in the player as well. So let's take a cut of that, go to our entity processes, and then just down the bottom we can put our check if stopped. Now let's create our function for our health bar, and I'll just call it show health bar. And what it's going to do, if we add a description here, we're just going to show the health bar above an entity's head. Now, I don't want to show the health bar when the player has full health or the enemy has full health, and also don't want to show it when they have 0 health. So let's set that up and say if our HP is not equal to HP max and our HP is greater than 0, then we can draw the health bar. Now, there is a function already for this, and it's called draw health bar. Now, instead of typing everything out, I've actually got it pre-typed, and I'll just paste that in, and then you can copy it down and have a look at what each one does. Basically, we're drawing a rectangle using these coordinates, and we're taking the percentage of HP over top of HP max, and that is used to show how much of the health bar we draw. These are the colors for the back and the minimum and maximum of where the health bar lies. And then there's some other settings here down the bottom. You can see what they are. So now that we have that, let's go back to our entity and where we're doing our draw event, we can actually just add this down below. Now, before we run this, the player doesn't have any HP variables. So we need to go to the player, go to their create event, and we can just add a HP max variable. I'll just set it to 10 for now. And therefore we want to set a HP variable to be that HP max value. Now let's test that out. And we get a little bar above so we can see which enemies we've damaged. Now the player obviously doesn't get any bars yet because we haven't done any enemies damaging the player. And you'll also notice I've got this spread out enemy look. There's a post over on Patreon which shows you how to do that if you want to spread the enemies out so they don't clump around the player. If you want to discuss your game dev journey or come talk about anything from the tutorials or even see the other projects I'm working on, including the project that delayed the release of this video by so many months, then come and join us over on my Discord server. The link is in the description below. The last thank you is to my rare Patreon members who generously have given to help keep the tutorials flowing. So thank you to these rare Patreon members. The series will continue in the next episode, so leave a comment with your suggestion on what we need to add to our dungeon crawler. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you in the next one.